November 1944. The air over the high plains of Wyoming was thin and sharp, a blade of cold honed by the endless wind. It scoured the dust from the flat, featureless earth and hurled it against the tar-papered walls of the barracks at Camp Hart Mountain, a place of geographic isolation and psychological exile. Inside, the world for the women of the 73rd Special Naval Landing Force, a unit known only in the most classified of Imperial Japanese and German high command documents, had shrunk to the dimensions of a cot, a splintered floor, and the unblinking gaze of their comrades. They were prisoners, but they did not see themselves as such. They were warriors in waiting, their spirits coiled like steel springs, their bodies honed by a doctrine that fused the ancient code of Bushido with the cold, racial calculus of National Socialism. They were the daughters of Yamato allied with the Übermensch, and their defeat was merely a temporary, strategic realignment in a war of cosmic, spiritual importance. Their leader, Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka, was a woman carved from ice and conviction. Her posture was a testament to a life of discipline, her gaze a reflection of an inner world where surrender was not a word, but a sacrilege. She and her soldiers had been captured on a remote Pacific atoll after a battle of unimaginable ferocity, a clash where their fanaticism had met the overwhelming, impersonal machinery of American industrial warfare. They had fought to the last bullet, then to the last broken blade, expecting death. Instead, they had been given medical attention, rations, and a long, humiliating journey into the heart of the beast they had been taught to despise. Their minds were fortresses built from the propaganda that had been their daily bread for a decade. The Americans, they knew, were a mongrel race, soft and decadent, a culture of chaotic individualism, their power a fragile illusion built on stolen wealth and moral decay. They were weak, prone to panic, and their supposed strength was a hollow shell that would shatter against a truly unified will. The guards at the camp only confirmed this belief. They were young, often careless, their faces open and unreadable in their simplicity, chewing gum and complaining about the cold. They were children playing at war. Akiko and her women spent their days in rigid formation, maintaining their military hierarchy in the face of their captors' baffling indifference. They performed drills in the frozen mud, their movements sharp and synchronized, a silent rebuke to the lazy posture of the American soldiers. They meditated on the Emperor's divine will and the Führer's historic destiny. They spoke only when necessary, their words clipped and precise. They were waiting for the moment of weakness, the crack in the facade, the inevitable collapse of this soft, rotting empire. They expected brutality to come eventually, a desperate lashing out from a failing power. They were prepared for starvation, for torture, for the honorable death that had been denied them in battle. They were prepared for anything except what was to come. What would you sacrifice for a belief you held to be absolute? Share your thoughts in the comments below. But they were not prepared for the shift that began in the third week of November. It was subtle at first, a change in the air, in the rhythm of the camp. Trucks began arriving with greater frequency, not with more barbed wire or armed guards, but with crates of unfamiliar goods. Strange smells began to drift from the main mess hall, a building they had never entered, as they were fed their bland but adequate rations in their own compound. The American guards, already lax in their discipline, became almost cheerful, their conversations filled with talk of home and leave, and a word that the Japanese translators in the unit struggled to contextualize: Thanksgiving. To the women of the 73rd, it sounded like another symptom of the enemy's weakness, a sentimental festival in the midst of total war. They watched with cold contempt as the activity intensified, seeing it as proof of the Americans' lack of focus, their inability to maintain the harsh, unwavering concentration required for victory. They were celebrating while the world burned. Pathetic. The rumors began as whispers in the latrines, a place of rare and fleeting privacy. One of the kitchen workers, a captured Nisei who served as a reluctant intermediary, spoke of impossible things. He spoke of dozens, then hundreds, of large frozen birds being delivered. He described sacks of potatoes that towered over a man, crates of onions, and barrels of a strange red berry. He talked about spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, scents that for the women were ghosts of a forgotten civilian life, luxuries that had vanished from their own homeland years ago in the name of austerity and the war effort. Akiko dismissed it as nonsense, a foolish attempt by the Americans to spread disinformation, to sow dissent, or create a false sense of security. Perhaps it was a feast for some visiting general. Perhaps it was all a lie, a story told by a broken man trying to curry favor. Her soldiers, however, were less certain. Their own bodies, lean and hard but perpetually hungry, registered the stories on a more primal level. The phantom smells from the mess hall were a form of torture, a constant, cloying reminder of a world of plenty that their ideology insisted could not exist here, in the heart of their failing enemy. Their cynicism was a shield, but it was beginning to crack under the weight of a bewildering aromatic assault. The Americans were planning something, and it was aimed not at their bodies, but at their minds. If you enjoy deep dives into the untold stories of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. The reality, when it was revealed, was more surreal and destabilizing than any lie. On the fourth Thursday of November, the camp commandant, a middle-aged major with weary eyes and a perpetually stooped posture, had the Nisei translator assemble the Japanese prisoners in the main yard. The air was frigid, their breath pluming in white clouds. They stood in perfect, defiant ranks expecting a new set of rules, a punishment, a declaration of some American victory. Instead, the major, through the translator, announced that in observance of the American national holiday of Thanksgiving, a traditional meal would be served to everyone in the camp, including them. There was a moment of absolute silence, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the wire. The women's faces, already masks of impassive discipline, became utterly blank. It was an absurdity, a joke in the worst possible taste, a trick. It had to be a trick. Akiko's mind raced through the possibilities, each more logical than the truth. The food would be drugged. It was a means to humiliate them, to force them to accept the charity of their captors and thus spiritually break them. It was a prelude to a mass interrogation, a final attempt to soften them before the real pain began. She held up a hand, a signal for her senior non-commissioned officer, Sergeant Ishida, a veteran of the brutal campaigns in China whose heart was a cold, hard stone. Ishida stepped forward. Through the translator, she formally and politely declined the offer on behalf of the entire unit. They had their own rations, she stated. They required nothing more. The commandant listened, his expression unchanged. He simply nodded and said, again through the translator, that the meal was not mandatory, but the invitation stood. The mess hall would be open for them. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the women standing alone in the biting wind, the silence now filled with a profound and unnerving confusion. Their refusal was a victory, a reassertion of their spiritual independence. But the smell was a traitor. It seeped under the doors of their barracks, a rich, complex perfume of roasted meat, baking bread, and sweet, warm spices. It was an invasion that their discipline could not repel. What is the most powerful weapon in a psychological war? A threat or an unexpected kindness? Let us know your theory. For the rest of the morning, a battle was waged within the confines of Barracks C. Akiko held her unit in a state of enforced meditation, trying to focus their minds on the purity of their cause, the transient nature of the flesh, the eternal glory of a selfless death for the Emperor. But the physical reality of their existence fought back. Their stomachs, accustomed to the bare minimum of subsistence, growled in protest. Their bodies, honed for combat, cried out for the fuel they were being denied. Young recruits, barely 18, who had known nothing but wartime rationing their entire adolescent lives, shifted uncomfortably on the floor, their eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. They had been taught that the enemy was a monster. But monsters did not bake pies. Monsters did not fill the air with the scent of a feast they were willing to share with their captives. The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight, a pressure building behind their eyes. Sergeant Ishida was Akiko's rock. Her face, a roadmap of harsh campaigns and harsher ideology, was unyielding. She moved through the barracks, her presence a silent reinforcement of Akiko's command. Her glare was enough to quell any sign of weakness. To her, this was the true test, more vital than any firefight. The Americans were using comfort as a weapon, decadence as a tool of corruption. To yield to a growling stomach was to yield their Japanese soul. They would starve before they would accept this poisoned gift. They would show these soft-bodied fools what true strength, what seishin, looked like. They would prove that the spirit of the samurai was impervious to the petty temptations of the flesh. They were a collective will, a single blade, and they would not be blunted by the scent of roasting turkey. But as noon approached, the first crack appeared. A young private, a girl named Hanai, who had been a communications specialist, fainted. When she was revived, she was weeping, not from hunger, but from a dizzying, overwhelming sense of confusion. Have you ever been in a situation where reality so completely contradicted your beliefs that it felt like you were losing your mind? We'd be fascinated to hear your story in the comments. The sight of Hanai's collapse sent a tremor through the unit. It was a sign of weakness, a stain on their collective honor. Yet no one moved to chastise her. In the girl's tear-streaked face, they saw a reflection of their own inner turmoil. The propaganda had been so simple, so clean. Americans were weak, yet their weakness produced an abundance that Japan, in all its spiritual strength, could not match. They were cruel, yet they offered food to their most hated enemies. They were incompetent, yet this camp, in the middle of a desolate wasteland, was organized with a casual, almost invisible efficiency. Every detail of their captivity, which they had initially interpreted as a sign of American decay, now seemed to be evidence of something else entirely. Something they had no words for. The simple, predictable world of good and evil, of spiritual purity and racial corruption was dissolving into 1,000 shades of grey. Akiko knew she was losing control, not of her soldiers' bodies, but of their minds. The foundation of their shared reality was fracturing. She had two choices: maintain her rigid stance and risk a mutiny of the soul, or make a strategic concession. She saw the guards outside, laughing as they tossed a ball back and forth, completely oblivious to the existential crisis unfolding in the barracks. Their ignorance was more insulting than any act of cruelty. They did not even see this as a battle. To them, it was just Thursday. This realization was the most profound shock of all. Their fanatical resistance, their spiritual war, was so insignificant to their captors that it did not even register. They were not seen as a threat to be broken, but as a problem to be managed, like livestock. The thought was a shard of glass in her mind. Humiliation, hot and sharp, burned away some of her certainty. She made a decision. It was not a surrender, she told herself. It was reconnaissance. They would go to the enemy's feast. They would observe. They would eat the food not as a gift, but as spoils of a psychological war, consuming the enemy's resources to maintain their own strength for the fight to come. They would go not in supplication, but in defiance. This internal justification, a desperate piece of mental gymnastics, was all that stood between her and the abyss of doubt, and so she gave the order. If this story is resonating with you, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates nuanced historical narratives. The march to the mess hall was a silent procession of ghosts. The women moved in perfect, synchronized steps, their faces impassive, their posture rigid. They were a sliver of the empire, a defiant island in a sea of alien comfort. As they entered the hall, the sensory assault became overwhelming. The warmth was the first shock. The building was heated to a degree that felt almost tropical compared to their own frigid barracks. The light was bright and clean, and the noise, it was a cacophony of life. American guards and administrative staff sat at long, wooden tables, talking, laughing, their voices relaxed and easy. There was no tension, no sign of the global conflict that was consuming millions of lives. It was an island of surreal peace in a world at war. Then they saw the food. It was laid out on long serving tables in a display of such profligate abundance that it defied comprehension. There were not one or two turkeys, but a dozen, their skins roasted to a deep, glistening brown. There were mountains of mashed potatoes, fluffy and white, with pools of molten butter. There were bowls of dark, rich gravy, trays of stuffing studded with herbs, dishes of candied sweet potatoes topped with melted marshmallows, a confection so bizarre it seemed to have come from another planet. There were green beans, corn, bread rolls stacked like cannonballs, and at the end of the line, a condiment they had never seen before, a shimmering, ruby-red jelly that the Americans were spooning onto their plates with gusto. It was not a meal. It was a spectacle, a vulgar, magnificent, terrifying spectacle of industrial might. The women stood frozen at the entrance, their military formation the only familiar thing in this profoundly strange new world. The Americans at the tables fell silent for a moment, their conversations halting as they turned to look at the silent, grey-clad figures. There was no hostility in their gaze, only a sort of mild, detached curiosity. Then a cook from behind the serving line, a large man with a white apron stretched tight over his belly, gestured with a ladle. He smiled. It was a simple, uncomplicated gesture. "Come, eat." What does true power look like? Is it a weapon, an army, or the ability to produce a feast in the middle of a war? Debate it in the comments. Sergeant Ishida's face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. This was worse than she could have ever imagined. The sheer wastefulness was an obscenity. Each of those turkeys could have fed a Japanese family for a week. The butter, the sugar, the flour, these were strategic materials, hoarded and rationed with draconian severity back home. Letters from her family spoke of meals made from acorns and sawdust, of a patriotic hunger that was sharpening the spirit of the nation. And here, their enemies were practically swimming in a sea of calories, treating it with such casual disregard. She saw a young guard drop a bread roll on the floor, pick it up, shrug, and toss it into a trash can. The act was so thoughtless, so profoundly alien to her reality of scarcity, that it felt like a physical blow. This was not a culture on the verge of collapse. This was something else. Akiko led the way. She picked up a tray, her movements deliberate and controlled. She would not show them her shock. She would not give them the satisfaction. She moved down the line, allowing the American cooks to place small, precise portions on her plate. A slice of turkey, a spoonful of potatoes, a dollop of the strange red jelly. Her soldiers followed her lead, their faces unreadable, their trays filled with a mosaic of colors and textures they had only ever seen in the most fanciful propaganda films depicting Western gluttony. They found an empty table at the far end of the hall and sat, their backs straight, their movements economical. They arranged themselves as if for a field briefing, not a meal. They were surrounded by the enemy, but they would maintain their isolation, their purity. They sat in silence, the food on their trays radiating a warmth that was both enticing and repulsive. They had been trained to endure anything, to overcome any obstacle through sheer force of will. But they had never been trained for this. They had never been trained for kindness. We create these documentaries to explore the hidden corners of the human experience. If you support this mission, consider becoming a patron through the link in the description. The first bite was the moment of surrender. It was not a conscious decision, but a physiological imperative. Akiko raised her fork, the metal feeling heavy and foreign in her hand. She cut a small piece of turkey and brought it to her lips. For a moment, she hesitated, the teachings of a lifetime warring with the simple animal need of her body. Then she ate. The flavor was an explosion in her mouth. It was moist, savory, and rich, with a depth of taste she had not experienced in years. It was not the bland, boiled subsistence of the barracks. It was food that had been prepared with care, with an abundance of ingredients, with the intention of providing not just sustenance, but pleasure. It was a revelation. It was a betrayal. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She looked up and saw her soldiers. One by one, they had begun to eat. The discipline that had held their faces in masks of stoic indifference dissolved. A young woman's eyes widened as she tasted the sweetness of the candied yams. Another closed her eyes in something akin to religious ecstasy as she savored a mouthful of stuffing. Sergeant Ishida, the unshakable Ishida, stared at her plate, her fork frozen in mid-air, a single, silent tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek before she angrily wiped it away. They were not just eating a meal, they were ingesting a truth that was as undeniable and as shocking as a battlefield explosion. The propaganda was a lie, all of it. Their leaders had lied to them. The world they had been told they were fighting to create, a world of spiritual purity and material sacrifice, was a phantom. The real world, the world of power and substance, was here, in this noisy, warm room, on this plate of food. They were not fighting a decadent, collapsing empire. They were fighting a nation that could produce this much food, this much casual plenty, and not even consider it remarkable. They were fighting a nation that could ship this feast to the middle of a frozen desert to feed its prisoners, not out of strategic calculation, but simply because it was a holiday. The sheer, terrifying scale of their enemy's strength was revealed not in a battleship or a bomber, but in a slice of turkey and a spoonful of cranberry sauce. What small detail has ever completely changed your perspective on a big issue? Share your story. As the meal progressed, a deeper, more unsettling transformation began to take place. The initial shock of the food's flavor gave way to a wave of complex and contradictory emotions. There was shame, a profound, burning shame at their own bodies' eager acceptance of the enemy's offering. They felt like animals, their higher ideals dissolving in a wash of saliva and gastric juices. Their years of training, of spiritual hardening, felt like a pathetic joke in the face of a well-cooked meal. Each bite was a small act of treason against the starving people back home, against the comrades who had died believing in the sacred cause. The food tasted of guilt. Then came the envy, a corrosive emotion they had been taught to despise as a weakness of the individualistic West. They watched the American guards. They saw them taking second, even third, helpings, piling their plates high with a careless abandon that spoke of a life where hunger was not a constant, gnawing companion. They saw them scraping leftovers into the trash, an act of wastefulness so profound it was almost a religious sacrilege. They envied not just the food, but the mindset that produced it, a mindset of such profound, unthinking security that this level of abundance was considered normal, something to be taken for granted. Their own lives had been a constant struggle for the bare minimum. These men, their inferiors in spirit and discipline, had been born into a world of effortless plenty. The injustice of it was a bitter pill to swallow. And finally, underneath the shame and the envy, a new feeling began to sprout, a feeling so foreign and unwelcome they barely recognized it, a grudging, unwilling respect. The logistics required to produce and transport this meal were staggering. To mobilize farms, factories, railways and trucks, all in the midst of a two-front global war, to deliver a holiday meal to a remote prison camp, this was not a sign of weakness. It was a demonstration of organizational power on a scale they could barely conceive. Their own empire, for all its talk of spiritual unity, struggled to get basic rations to its frontline troops. The Americans, for all their supposed chaos and indiscipline, had created a system of such overwhelming efficiency that it could afford to be generous. It was a terrifying thought. They had been taught they were fighting against a house of cards. They were beginning to suspect they were ants trying to storm a fortress of solid steel. Has an act of kindness from an unexpected source ever made you question your own beliefs? It's a powerful experience, and we'd like to hear about it. Akiko Tanaka looked down at her empty plate. The meal was over, but the war inside her had just begun. She studied the faces of her women. The hard, fanatical certainty was gone, replaced by a quiet, shell-shocked bewilderment. They looked younger, more vulnerable. The ideological armor had been stripped away, leaving them exposed to a reality they were not equipped to process. They had been prepared to die for their beliefs. They were not prepared to have those beliefs so thoroughly and effortlessly dismantled by a plate of food. She thought of the training, the years of indoctrination, the sacred oaths sworn to the emperor. She thought of the propaganda films showing heroic Japanese soldiers sharing their last grain of rice while bloated, cigar-chomping American capitalists laughed. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed fantasy designed to sustain a war that she now realized had been lost before it even began. The true battlefield was not on the islands of the Pacific. It was in the factories of Detroit, the wheat fields of Kansas, and the logistics offices of the Pentagon. It was in the minds of a people who considered this level of abundance to be their birthright. How could you defeat an enemy who had so much they could afford to feed you better than your own army could? How could you fight a system whose casual waste was greater than your own nation's total production? The answer was simple and devastating. You couldn't. The war was not a contest of will or spirit. It was a contest of systems, of industrial capacity, of the ability to organize reality. And their system, for all its beauty and spiritual purity, was a fragile, hollow thing compared to this. The Thanksgiving meal was not an act of kindness. It was not a psychological trick. It was, in its own way, the most brutal and effective weapon the Americans had deployed against them. It did not kill their bodies. It annihilated their souls. It was an act of casual, unintentional, and utterly overwhelming power. The sight of a B-29 bomber overhead had been terrifying. The taste of pumpkin pie was infinitely more devastating. This story explores the clash of ideologies. If you're interested in how different cultures perceive the world, you'll love our video on cultural relativism, linked here. The walk back to the barracks was different. The synchronized military precision was gone. The women walked with their heads down, their steps shuffling and uncertain. They were no longer a single, unified blade. They were a collection of broken individuals, each lost in her own private world of doubt and disillusionment. The cold air no longer felt like a purifying force, but simply like cold. The barracks no longer felt like a fortress of the spirit, but simply like a prison. The silence that fell between them was no longer one of disciplined unity, but of shared, unspoken shame. They had been defeated, not by guns or bombs, but by gravy and sweet potatoes. In the weeks that followed, the change was palpable. The rigid drills became less frequent, less sharp. The communal meditation sessions were abandoned. The women still obeyed orders, but the fire in their eyes was gone, replaced by a haunted, weary emptiness. They had seen behind the curtain, and the truth of the world was too vast and too demoralizing to bear. They began to speak to the Nisei translator, asking questions they would have considered treasonous only a month before. They asked about American farms, they asked about factories, they asked about the lives of ordinary people. Each answer was another nail in the coffin of their worldview. They learned that the guards' complaints were not about real hardship, but about boredom. They learned that the feast they had eaten was not a special event for the military, but a tradition celebrated in almost every home in the country. They learned that this nation of soft individualists had mobilized its entire economy with a speed and totality that made the Axis war machine look like a cottage industry. Akiko watched this slow-motion collapse with a sense of profound detachment. Her own identity had been so completely interwoven with her ideology that its destruction left her feeling hollowed out, a stranger in her own skin. She was Lieutenant Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a warrior, a servant of the divine emperor. But who was she if the empire was a lie? Who was she if the divine cause was a futile, tragic mistake? She remembered the taste of the turkey, the warmth of the hall, the easy laughter of the guards. These sensory memories were now more real to her than the abstract concepts of honor, glory, and racial purity. She had been a true believer. Now she believed in nothing. The war would continue for another year, but for her and the women of the 73rd, it was already over. Their surrender had taken place not on a deck of a battleship, but at a dinner table in Wyoming. What happens to a soldier when the cause they fought for is proven to be a lie? This is a profound question we explore in many of our historical analyses. The years after the war were a long, slow process of coming to terms with that Thanksgiving Day. The women of the 73rd were repatriated to a Japan that was as broken and disillusioned as they were. Their homeland had been scorched by firebombs and humbled by atomic weapons, its cities in ruins, its people starving. The divine emperor had declared himself a mortal man. The entire edifice of their former lives had been burned to the ground. In this new, uncertain world, the memory of the feast at Camp Hart Mountain became a strange and powerful touchstone. For many, it was a source of bitter resentment, a constant reminder of the humiliation and the lie they had been fed. For others, it was a lesson, a brutal but necessary education in the nature of modern power. Akiko Tanaka never spoke of her military service again. She melted back into civilian life, becoming a quiet, unassuming librarian in a small town near Kyoto. She married, raised children, and grew old. But every year, on the fourth Thursday of November, she would perform a small, private ritual. She would go to one of the new American-style supermarkets that had begun to spring up in Japan and buy a small chicken, some potatoes, and a can of cranberry sauce. She would prepare a simple meal, a pale imitation of the feast she remembered. Her family found her annual tradition eccentric, a strange affectation for a woman who was otherwise so traditional. They did not understand. They did not understand that for her, this meal was not a celebration. It was a memorial. It was an act of remembrance for the woman she had been, the unshakable true believer who had died in a warm, noisy room in the middle of a frozen American desert. She was not honoring the holiday of her former enemies. She was acknowledging the undeniable, indigestible truth that had been served to her on a plastic tray so many years ago. The truth that wars are not won by spirit alone. They are won by systems, by logistics, by the unglamorous, overwhelming power of abundance. The turkey was not just a bird, it was a symbol of a force as powerful and as indifferent as nature itself. It was the symbol of her defeat and, in a strange way, of her liberation. The story of the 73rd Special Naval Landing Force is a testament to the fact that the most profound battles are often fought not with weapons, but with ideas, and sometimes with a simple meal.